Okay, now one of the things that we spent most of our time looking at in the first broadcast were some of the various techniques developed by the intelligence agencies and the military to effect mind control. Now, one of the things we looked at were a couple of techniques called RHIC and EDOM. RHIC stands for Radio Hypnotic Intracerebral Control. EDOM stands for Electronic Dissolution of Memory. Essentially, RHIC called for the implantation of a small electronic radio receiver, a stimulator which could stimulate a muscle upon receiving a signal. And what this did basically was to set off a hypno-programmed cue in the victim or subject, and this elicited a conditioned behavior. Now, electronic dissolution of memory called for the remote control production of acetylcholine, which basically blocked the transmission of nerve impulses in the brain and results in a sort of amnesia, and that wiped out the memory of the person who's been under or placed under mind control. Okay? Now, after that, we took a look at a number of different assassination programs that had been undertaken by the military or the intelligence community. We took a look at a technique or a program whereby assassins or would-be assassins were recruited by the Navy specifically, and they were then shown films to desensitize them to violence, and eventually were sort of assigned out as assassins, particularly operating out of American embassies abroad. And following that, we took a look at a fellow by the name of Castillo. Now, he, according to a number of, much of the information presented while he was being interviewed by the Philippine Security Service, that he not only had apparently been assigned to assassinate or attempt to assassinate Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos, but he also, according to much of the information presented, was involved in the assassination of President Kennedy as well. Okay. Following that, we took a look at some information presented by a U.S. government assassin, which maintained that mind control had been effected by the police agencies and the FBI as well, that they basically had mind control programs underway. Another thing he pointed out was that ultrasound was often used for effecting mind control on assassins. Okay, and we're going to be picking up at much the same place in this particular broadcast. We're going to be talking about assassinations, and specifically, we're going to begin talking about, well, we'll resume, I should say, talking about the possibility of mind control in connection with some of the figures involved in the assassination of President Kennedy. Okay? First piece of information we're going to look at here comes from a book called Operation Mind Control. Operation Mind Control was authored by a man named Walter Boert. It was published in softcover by Dell, copyrighted 1978. Now, the fellow we're talking about here is a guy by the name of George de Mohrenschildt. Now, George de Mohrenschildt, those of you who heard our series on the Guns of November about the assassination of President Kennedy, was basically Lee Harvey Oswald's intelligence babysitter. He sort of stewarded Lee Harvey Oswald and Marina around, introduced them to a number of different people, including the Paynes, who ultimately got Lee Harvey Oswald his job at the Texas School Book Depository. They also, George de Mohrenschildt was also a German spy during World War II. He had connections to the Nobel oil family of White Russia, and apparently his father managed the Baku oil fields for the Nobel family. Now, when the House Select Committee on Assassinations was investigating George de Mohrenschildt and his links to Lee Harvey Oswald, one of the things that they basically were checking out, well, while they were checking this out, George de Mohrenschildt died of a shotgun blast to the head. And there are indications that that shotgun blast may have been self-administered and may have been the result of mind control. Now, when we were talking about Mr. Castillo last time, one of the things that one of the disturbing types of behavior that Castillo demonstrated was that when his name was called, he basically pretended to, well, he would hold a phantom gun. Of course, he was under hypnosis. He didn't realize that it was a phantom gun, and attempted to kill himself whenever his name was mentioned. Now, one of the focuses of the CIA and military mind control programs has been to get people to commit suicide on command when that was deemed necessary. Now, going back to reading from Operation Mind Control by Walter Boert about George de Mohrenschildt and the possibility that he was under mind control. In late March 1977, de Mohrenschildt's name was brought before the newly formed House Select Committee on Assassinations. Willem Oltmans told the committee that de Mohrenschildt held the key to the Kennedy assassination, that de Mohrenschildt had privately confessed to him that prior to the assassination, he was aware of a conspiracy to murder the president in Dallas. According to Oltmans, de Mohrenschildt was about to have a book published which would reveal the details of his knowledge of the assassination. After Oltmann's testimony, a spokesman for the House Committee on Assassinations said that the committee would investigate his claims and would, if warranted, track down de Mohrenschildt for questioning. He was located a week later in Palm Beach, Florida, but he could not be called to testify. George de Mohrenschildt was found dead, the victim of a gunshot wound in the head. Local officials termed his death a suicide. Following de Mohrenschildt's death, his Dallas attorney, Pat Russell, supported Oltmann's claims to the commission. He verified the fact that before his death, de Mohrenschildt had insisted that persons other than Lee Harvey Oswald had participated in the slaying of President Kennedy. The attorney revealed that he had in his possession tapes, a book-length manuscript, and a photograph which de Mohrenschildt had turned over to him earlier. He said the tapes consisted of 10 reels of interviews with de Mohrenschildt about the Kennedy assassination, which he claimed were first-hand accounts of the late professor's recollections of Oswald. Russell said that although he did not know if the tapes or the book contained any new evidence, the photograph should be of particular interest to assassination investigators. He claimed that although the photo was similar to a well-known picture obtained by the Dallas police which showed Lee Harvey Oswald holding a rifle and wearing a pistol, what made the photograph interesting was that it was autographed on the back by Oswald and dated May 4th, 1963, approximately 6 months prior to the assassination. After de Mohrenschildt's death, Willem Oltmans, O-L-T-M-A-N-S, released a portion of his interview with the deceased. Oltmans described him as, quote, Oswald's most intimate friend, unquote, and without offering an explanation, said that he had been intimate with Oswald during, quote, the years when Oswald's brain was being programmed toward the murder of the century, unquote. And of course, that refers to the possibility that Lee Harvey Oswald was also under mind control, although it appears that he did not kill President Kennedy.
Okay, continuing on with Walter Bowert's book, and the same section, it says, in the interview dated February 23, 1977, de Mohrenschildt told Oltmans, quote, in June 1976, I completed a manuscript. That's when disaster struck. You see, in that book, I played the devil's advocate. Without directly implicating myself as an accomplice in the JFK assassination, I still mentioned a number of names, particularly of FBI and CIA officials who apparently may not be exposed under any circumstances. I was drugged surreptitiously. As a result, I was committed to a mental hospital. I was there 8 weeks and was given electric shocks and, as a consequence, I sometimes forget certain details temporarily. De Mohrenschildt went on to say that as a result of the drugs and shocks, he could take no more. Quote, I tried to commit suicide 5 times. One of these days I will put a revolver to my head, unquote. According to Oltmans, de Mohrenschildt left Dallas in the middle of the night on March 3, 1977, telling him, quote, I don't want anybody to see me. Oltmans reported that at the time de Mohrenschildt was in a state of panic, constantly worried whether they would let him leave the country. Quote, he always felt watched and followed, Oltmans said. I really cannot see how somebody who does not have anything to hide would develop such behavior, unquote. On the day he died, George de Mohrenschildt was being interviewed by author Edward J. Epstein for a book, The Legend of Lee Harvey Oswald. They broke for lunch at 1 o'clock, and Epstein walked de Mohrenschildt to his car. They were supposed to resume the interview at 3 p.m., and, when de Mohrenschildt didn't return, Epstein called his room and heard a distraught maid tell him that de Mohrenschildt had taken his own life. De Mohrenschildt's daughter, Alexandra, told Epstein that she believes her father took his own life after having had a post-hypnotic suggestion triggered by a voice over the telephone in his room. The last days of George de Mohrenschildt sound strikingly similar to those of the victims of mind control. Could it have been that when drugs and electric shock failed to erase his memory, the final solution was prescribed? Or was he programmed to self-destruct? Okay, now, something that has to be pointed out, especially to those of you who are just tuning in for the first time. Allegations of somebody like George de Mohrenschildt talking about having been in a mental hospital, having people follow him, trying to commit suicide 5 times and things like that. To people not familiar with the story of the Kennedy assassination, it may sound like, well, obviously this guy was a fringe case, you know, a loony, a psycho, and there's no surprise that a man like this would kill himself. Well, again, to people who are familiar with the Kennedy assassination, and for even just scraping the surface a little bit, I would recommend you back to the special that Dave and I did, The Guns of November. The Kennedy assassination and the people who tried to investigate it and the key witnesses in the Kennedy assassination have been dogged by this kind of thing all the way down the line. 20, 30, 40, 50 key people involved in the Kennedy assassination have met death in strange and odd ways, many of them convinced that they were in danger before they died, under odd circumstances and all kinds of things. And George de Mohrenschildt himself was definitely a key player. He was not merely some fringe character wandering around claiming to know deep and secret things. He was somebody with an intelligence background, who had been accused of being a Nazi spy, who was Lee Harvey Oswald's companion, and had many, many very strange and unusual things about his background and his, de Mohrenschildt's, involvement with the intelligence complex. So this is not just somebody wandering in off the street. And as those of you who have heard some of this Kennedy stuff and who perhaps heard the first broadcast know, again, these are the classic symptoms of something going on in terms of somebody being manipulated rather than merely a bunch of loonies walking on the street.
A couple of other points. First of all, George de Mohrenschildt was not only fiercely anti-communist, he was a white Russian, recall. His father had worked for the Nobel family who'd prospered under the Tsar, but he was a Nazi intelligence agent and basically an aristocrat. Now, Lee Harvey Oswald was an alleged leftist, allegedly with only an 8th grade education, and this fits into the pattern that we saw in the Guns of November. And those of you who perhaps missed that show can contact us after the broadcast, and we can tell you how to pick up copies of it. That basically alleged leftist and 8th grade educated Lee Harvey Oswald seemed to roll around with fiercely anti-communist white Russians, Nazis, and high rollers in the aerospace industry, which is a strange set of bedfellows if ever there were or was. Anyway, another thing to take note of with George de Mohrenschildt is the possibility, and this was suggested by his daughter Alexandra, that his suicide was committed by or triggered by a telephone cue. Now, this is a pattern that we're going to see later, in particular with a woman named Candy Jones. So try and remember this George de Mohrenschildt telephone connection, because one of the things that was developed in mind control was the ability to trigger a hypno-programmed agent or patsy by using a telephone cue, and it's something we're going to run into a little later.
Okay. I think that, second of all, we're going to talk about a little bit about Robert F. Kennedy and the death of Robert F. Kennedy. Now, one of the key things here is that, and I know this for a fact because one of my own friends, a teacher, told me the other day, who's a man who himself does not believe the Warren Commission story of the John F. Kennedy assassination, this man has worked in Washington for Hubert Humphrey and has taught history for a number of years here in the area, has been to Russia. I mean, this man has gotten around. However, he said to me the other day, well, at least the Robert F. Kennedy assassination, that's one that I guess nobody can argue with. Well, as longtime listeners to this and other types of programming on KFJC are familiar, indeed there's a lot to quibble with the Robert F. Kennedy assassination. In a nutshell, though, however, and one of the main reasons that people say this is because, as opposed to the John F. Kennedy assassination, everybody felt that the assassin had been seen in plain view, putting the bullets into the candidate, Senator Robert Kennedy, that killed him, and was immediately captured on the scene. And most people felt, well, that just about proves it. You can't pretend that there's somebody that nobody saw firing from a grassy knoll or blah, blah, blah. However, as the case turned out, and much of the Robert F. Kennedy's case, and much of the case against Sirhan Sirhan was severely crippled, although it didn't keep him from being put in jail for it, by the coroner's own report. And the coroner himself was the first person to come up with a report, a forensic pathological report that basically refuted the early conclusions that Sirhan Sirhan had acted alone and had shot Robert Kennedy to death. Put briefly, it was because of what is called stapling. The bullet wound that killed Robert F. Kennedy was behind his right ear. It showed evidence of stapling, which are powder burns, and which cannot happen unless the gun is within 6 inches of the tissue being fired at, namely the back of his head. And specifically, Coroner Thomas Noguchi, who, as a matter of fact, has a book out now called Coroner and is doing a promotional tour promoting that book, Coroner Noguchi's testified that the fatal shot was fired from a distance of less than 1 inch from the back of Senator Kennedy's right ear. And since eyewitnesses in the pantry of the Ambassador Hotel basically placed Sirhan anywhere from 3 to 11 feet in front
of Senator Kennedy. It's problematic as to how he could have fired a shot from less than 1 inch from the back of his head when he was standing 3 to 11 feet in front of him. If you can figure that out, please let us know.
Indeed. There's a lot of discussion about witnesses not seeing things quite right the way that they happen, and divergence in testimony. Certainly there was divergence in the testimony of the witnesses. However, that was due to Sirhan thrashing around in the arms of the people who grabbed him as he was firing the shots. But not a single witness, and several placed him up as close as 3 or 4 feet. Not a single witness of some 20 or 30 interviewed had him anywhere near enough to Robert F. Kennedy to fire that fatal shot.
The majority placed him about 7 or 8 feet in front of Senator Kennedy.
Now, some things came up later, which, again, we're not going to go into the whole Robert F. Kennedy assassination tonight, but among other things, there were bullet holes and bullet wounds